So this is just a quick video to show you how to use the Mixer for Decal Designer. Before we start, my idea for Mixer was supposed to surprise you with ideas and get you in the general area of the decal you had in mind. I want to harness the power of procedural textures and noises to suggest things you might not have thought of and to make sure that your decal is always unique and you'll never see the same decal twice. If you try and use the Mixer and get an exact end goal in mind, you might find it a little bit frustrating. Instead, you should just rapidly prototype ideas and save out the decals that are close to what you want. And afterwards, close the Mixer, open up the graph instance, and then you can fine tune right down to the pixel. First thing you want to do is make sure the correct plugins are enabled. Go to Edit Plugins and make sure Substance in Unreal 4 or Unreal 5 is enabled. And now go to Built-in Plugins and search for a script. And make sure the editor scripting utilities are enabled. Otherwise, the Mixer won't work correctly. Next, you want to go to the Mixer map, which is under Maps and Decal Mixer. And you just need to click Play to start Decal Mixer, or Alt-P is the shortcut. So once you load the Mixer, you'll see it'll already start to create decals for you. I'm just going to hit the Maximize or Full Screen button here so we can see a little better. A quick run through of the controls. Over here, you have your controls for texture resolution while you're working. Here's the main parameter controls for the Mixer itself. And here you just have some color controls for the colors that have been used with Mixer. Every element of the UI has tooltips if you hover over it, which will give you a bit more information about what each button does. Or you can click the little help button here. The watch button shows you this little tutorial. If you click on Learn, it'll bring up the online documentation, which has all the technical reference for all the parameters. There's lots of stuff here for you to read. Or if you want direct support, leave some feedback or suggest a feature, click here on the support button. Finally, there's a button here to leave a review on the Unreal Store just to let me know your honest feedback. If you look down here, there's a hotkey reference for the controls for Mixer. So you can move around with WASD. Looking is with the right mouse button held down. You can make small, medium and large changes, which I'll show you in a moment, as well as adjusting how much those changes are. You can control the environment by shift and right mouse button. We can increase the light with up and down arrow keys. So increase it right up. We'll bring the HDRIs right down. You can also reset the lights just by pressing both up and down at the same time. We can also change the scenes, left and right, switches between a selection of scenes. I try to pick a good range that shows interior, exterior, which helps to cover most of the environments I think that you'll use decals in. You can toggle the ground just by pressing the G key. And the Calibrator is the C key here, just to see a material color calibrator. So like I said, here's the resolution controls. You can knock this right down to 256. This changes the resolution of all the decals that you create, or 1024. This is a quality setting, draft, medium or high. This is mainly to improve performance while you're working. I recommend medium and 1024 while you're working. And once you're happy with the end result, you can switch it to maybe 2K and high, and that'll give you a high quality output. Changing the quality settings just uses quicker processes under the hood to make the textures. So I'd advise using medium while you're working and 1K. That's what I found worked best for me because we're generating a lot of textures at any one moment here. So if we come over to this decal here, and I'll use it as an example just to show you some of the controls. So if I left click, I'll get large changes to the decal. If I roll the mouse wheel, there'll be smaller changes. They'll sort of stay within the same sort of general area, the decal. And finally, if you hold down control and roll the mouse wheel, you get really fine changes. So you can just tweak that decal just to the final look that you want. So it's left click for big changes, roll the mouse wheels for sort of medium changes, and roll the mouse wheel and control just to get fine tweaks. Over on the left here are the Mixer settings, which controls what's happening with the decals. Now I'll come over here to the decal just as an example, just so we can talk through what each of them do. We've got a couple of modes here, which I'll go through in a moment. The first thing I want to talk about are the patterns A and B. So right now, they're both set to randomize with these little toggles. So when I click, I'll always get a random decal. If I were to turn off randomize for pattern B, you notice that pattern B, which is these little rocks, will always stay the same. But the underlying layer, which is the pattern A, is always changing. So you can see it's nicely adapting to whatever is going on underneath. And if I'm rolling the mouse wheel here, I'm getting variations on that decal. And again, if I hold down control and roll the mouse wheel, I'm getting much sort of finer adjustments of that decal. So this is the fine control here. You can see that the little stones are gathering in the crevices of the underlying map. Next is the amount, and this controls how much randomization is allowed for the visibility of the layers. So if I bring this up, the layers can either be really visible or there'll be very little amount. And if I change it, it sort of randomizes. This is like the min and max amount that's allowed to be shown. Next is the normal range. So if I bring that up, you can see now the normal map is being generated for this decal. Because I've set this to a high value, it'll bounce around anywhere between no normal map and the maximum normal map that I've set. So if I roll the mouse wheel here, you can see I'm getting sort of, sometimes it's very little normal, sometimes a lot, just because the range that I've set allows for any normals up until this maximum amount. Here we've got edge pattern. So if you bring it down to the first one, there's sort of no edge decal here. This is just a fully tiling texture. 2 is sort of square shape and so on, or you can just hit random and it'll give you, some of them are sort of cornery style decals, some are circular, some are square, there's ones that are more like strips. You've got parallax occlusion mapping also, so if I bring this amount up, and this is quite cool for adding depth to your decals. But if you have quite an extreme amount of parallax occlusion mapping, sometimes you want to control the balance of the height map that's being used. So if I bring it to the right, you kind of get more softer shapes for the height map. So you won't get as much sort of tearing in the parallax occlusion mapping. So if I bring it to the right, that kind of softens out the height map that's being used. Generally, you don't want to go too extreme with the parallax occlusion mapping, just because it starts to break. Now, the only problem with parallax occlusion mapping, and it's kind of an engine limitation, is that it only works in a top-down manner with decals. If I were to place these decals with parallax occlusion mapping on a wall, they'll look horribly stretched and weird. So you kind of can only use parallax occlusion mapping on decals that are on the ground. There is a workaround or a fix for that, but it'd be very performance intensive. Coming down here to randomize, I've got various buttons here I can turn on and off, which allow the randomization of various features of the decals. By default, color swapping is on. I'll just show you what that means. So if I just change this to sort of a red color and this to a green color. So right now, if I roll the mouse wheel, sometimes the rocks are the red color and whatever's underneath is the green color. And then sometimes the sort of rock shapes are the green color and whatever is underneath is the red color. That's just color swapping. So it's just swapping the assigned colors. If I turn that off, you'll see now that the rocks will always be the red color. It's like setting a fixed color. First randomize button I'll toggle here is masking, which allows height-based masking when combining layers. So I'll toggle it on and off. And you'll see that sometimes one of the layers will mask out the other. To what extent is randomized for now? So you can see there that some of the edges of this stone was sort of chipped away by the underlying sort of grid pattern. It's quite cool for allowing sort of one material to sit over the top of the other in a convincing manner. So you can see there, the stone was sort of cut by this grid pattern instead this time. Contrast just randomize the contrast for the decal itself. Invert, are the decals allowed to invert? It's random, so you won't see it every time. Style uses curves to stylize the look of a layer. Blend randomizes whether the layers are allowed to be additive or subtractive. So I just turned that on there, and the stone pattern is now subtractive, so it's being etched away from that underlying grid layer. Blur, are the layers allowed to blur, and to what extent is, again, just random. So sometimes there's a little blur, sometimes a lot. Again, it's good for sort of liquids and stuff. So I'm going to show this blur below randomize feature. I'm just going to change a few properties just so it's more obvious. The important thing to know about these color selectors is that they're not just purely color selectors, there's also roughness and metallic values you can enter here. I'm going to adjust the value variation of this underlying layer just so we can see it a bit more. And blur below is very handy for liquids, and what it does is it selectively blurs this underlying layer based on the mask of the layer above. So if we enable it, you can see it's blurring it as well as randomizing the opacity of this top layer. So if I just swizzle that a few times, you can see here this underlying layer is now being randomly blurred. So this is great for puddles or stains. You've still got the underlying information and it's sort of being blurred to a varying degree. You can see here, it looks like maybe like stained paper or water soaked, something or other. You can see how blur below works quite well for simulating better interactions between materials. In combination with blur below, you can also use normal thickness. So if I enable that, you can see here where anywhere where we have this part of the decal, the underlying normals are being softened. So I'll just swizzle it there and just see if we can see it a little bit better with this version. So again here with thickness off, it just sort of looks stamped over the top. But if I know normal thickness, I'm getting a nice softening of normals anywhere underneath this part of the decal. So that's blur below. Next you've got normal softness, that just randomizes the softness of the decal. Normal trim, this trims the normal shape in either the high or the low sections, and this is useful for surfaces such as puddles, etc. So if I enable it here, you can see that the highest part of this decal is sort of all getting sliced off in a plane. If you can see that here. So if I turn it off and on again, we'll get various, it'll sort of randomly choose between the high and low points. So again, this is quite good for just getting some really nice effects. It's also good for surfaces which have been cast or scraped, like cast concrete. So you can see here the high sections of that normal being trimmed off. Next you got normal style, which just uses curves to stylize the look of the normal. So these are sort of bigger, rounder, puffier shapes. Sometimes you get the tops trimmed off again. Finally, down here, you've got some randoms for offset, rotation, and tile safe rotation. Now, by default, some of the shapes, such as these grid patterns, don't allow rotations because they would look pretty strange. So if I change the pattern, let's just go back to random. So you can randomize the rotation or the tile safe rotation. That'll just, if I change the edge pattern to 1, you'll see that this would perfectly tile if we line them up next to each other. Finally, down the bottom here, you've got options for custom textures. So there's any texture in your library you can just use here. If I just minimize full screen for a second, if you come down to Mixer and Custom Textures, any texture that you drop in here will be available for use when you open the Mixer. So just before you open the Mixer, just copy any texture into here and you'll have access to it once you're in the Mixer itself. So if I full screen again, click on here, just click on this logo, for example. That texture has now been used as part of the mix. And it's being affected by all the layers, all the options that you've got on here. So if I turn on blurring, for example, it's actually that texture is being blurred and affected by the options that we've turned on here. Or if you've generated any textures you like yourself, you can also include those here. And the offset and the randomized rotation, everything works with it. So everything works with whatever that custom texture that you put in here. So this pattern B is contextual. If I control and slide the mouse button, you can see here I'm getting really nice drip effects. And say I change my custom texture back to my name. Got the same effect happening with my logo. So let's say now that we're happy that the decal that we want to use, let's say it's this logo one here, just hit the save button. And I'm just going to call this logo, for example. You can click anywhere you want to save it, but by default it goes to this Mixer save folder. Hit save, and then you get confirmation that it's saved. And now you can see here that in that save folder, I've actually got all the textures have been saved. If I close that for now. So what I've got here is the Substance Graph instance and all the textures that I generated. If you really want to fine tune that decal even more, you can come in here and control it on a really fine scale. Or if you actually want to place a decal in your level, I've made a handy little script that just automatically makes a decal out of this. Right click, scripted actions, create decal from graph. And now if I drop this into my level, I can happily go around and start placing this in the world.